Bucha. So the Russians had occupied this town for, I don't know, a couple months. Shortly after their invasion of Ukraine, they quickly blitzkrieged down to Bucha within a week or two, and there was quite a bit of fighting there. I think it was on the border of zones of control between Ukraine and Russia. So I'm sure there was lots of shelling going back and forth. Um, so the media, as I've started seeing this on Telegram on some pro-Ukrainian telegrams the other day, videos of bodies strewn about in the middle of the street. You have one particular video that made a lot of circulation around Telegram, and I believe I even saw it on Twitter. And it showed some Ukrainian forces driving down a street, and there's random bodies strewn about. And then there's this report of a mass grave with 300 civilians, I suppose. A mass grave has been discovered in Bucha, blah blah. Bodies buried in a grave. Okay. CNN saw at least a dozen bodies. So I'm seeing nothing saying that these were actually civilians. So that it's look, I remain a little bit incredulous insofar as the allegations that the Russians unequivocally started murdering civilians as they left the city of Bucha. Now we've had, you know, so much misinformation and disinformation. We had the Ghost of Kiev, we had Snake Island off the top of my head. Oh, and I saw, of course, Gonzalo Lira did some sleuthing along with some other uh, online sleuths regarding a series of videos that were released that were obviously completely fake, completely conjured up. They seem to use one particular city or town as a set to do three videos that were one with this, kind of attractive woman that was obviously an actress that was supposedly a female, soldier. But you could look at Gonzalo Lira's Telegram he did and his YouTube, if that video's still up, and he explains it. So we've seen just all sorts of psychological operations. Uh, but atrocities always happen in war. Consider this. Consider you're a soldier or you are an officer heading a squad or company platoon of soldiers. You've been fighting this war. You've been dealing with, people killing your buddies. You start to get desensitized towards the act of killing people yourself. When you capture someone or suspect someone of being on the other side and you've lost friends and you've gone through the horrors of this war yourself, then in all human beings, it arouses intense feelings of anger, bitterness. And throughout history, we've seen that those feelings get out of control. Um, Usually, usually, and thankfully, they are localized events that are essentially crimes of passion. For example, one of the most famous atrocities ever in the history of U.S. history would be the Life Massacre, and that was a crime of passion. The U.S. government didn't order the atrocity to take place. They didn't order that atrocity to be committed. The chain of command was not aware of the atrocity for some time. It was a company, Company C, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, and Company B, 4th Battalion, 3rd Infantry Regiment, 11th Brigade, 23rd Infantry Division, two elements of the United States military, having gone through more than any of us can ever imagine. Not to excuse what they did, but they committed a crime of passion because during, the Vietnam War, as is in the case of most modern wars, civilians are often working for the enemy, and you have to abide by the rules of engagement, whether you want to or not. The soldiers of these elements of the U.S. military, perhaps out of anger and a mixture of suspicion, massacred an entire village. So atrocities do happen. They happen in every war. The Russians, I have no doubt, the Russian military, elements of the Russian military, have committed atrocities, have committed war crimes. It happens in every single war. In Iraq in 2003, the United States committed war crimes. In Afghanistan, the United States committed war crimes. In Georgia in 2008, the country of Georgia, Russia committed war crimes. In 1998, in Chechnya, or was it 1998, 1999, the Russian military flattened the city of Grozny. It was a war crime. Well, then there's the actual legal definition of a war crime. The legal definition would be the intentional killing of civilians. So in the case of Grozny, no excuse for what they did, destroying an entire city, but they did open humanitarian corridors for any civilians who wanted to and were able to flee. And then they flattened the city, and a lot of civilians died. So not really an intentional act of killing civilians, as far as we know, as far as, there is evidence of. But civilians died. Now, another war crime we see in the case of usually defenders in a war is the use of civilians as human shields. And that happened in Grozny. That happened in Iraq. That happened, I'm sure, even in the Civil War, the United States Civil War. It happened in World War II. The Soviets did quite a bit of that. They forced civilians to stay in certain cities when the Germans were attacking. So that's a war crime as well. You are intentionally putting civilians in harm's way. So there's that kind of so atrocities do happen. And sometimes the atrocities come from the very top. Sometimes it is a government that sanctions and orders the war crime, the Holocaust, and all of the war crimes, not all of them, but most of the war crimes that the German army and SS committed in World War II came directly from the top. Those were government-sanctioned war crimes. So atrocities happen. Atrocities are happening right now in Ukraine. There was there's some shelling going on that the Russians are doing that's killing civilians. Now, they say they are opening humanitarian corridors, and they say that, and there are allegations that have surfaced, credible allegations. One in particular from some Greeks that fled Mariupol, that ended up in Greece, and they went all over the Greek media, and they said that for the Ukrainian forces in Mariupol weren't allowing civilians to leave. They were using them as human shields, according to them. So far, and I have not seen any like evidence of an actual legally defined war crime on the part of the Russians. Now, I am quite sure there have been some committed. And then I see allegations, honestly, the kneecapping incident. Where was that? Kherson. I see some evidence, and I'm not willing to say I believe irrefutably the claims, but I see some evidence of Ukrainian war crimes, which would make sense because the Ukrainian government is, look, before this war started, before everybody started to paint a rosy picture of Ukraine, it was widely known that the Ukrainian government is patently corrupt. We all knew that. So it wouldn't surprise me if also the Ukrainians are committing war crimes. So what happened in Bucha is supposedly the Ukrainians, like I said a minute ago, entered the city. I believe 4 days, 3 to 4 days after the Russians evacuated Bucha. And this is what I'm getting from sources that I see on Telegram from both sides. Ukrainians entered about 3 to 4 days after the Russians supposedly evacuated. And they're saying they found all sorts of I saw the videos myself of the civilians, of dead civilians in the middle of the street, strewn about the streets. Now, I can't believe these videos offhand I can't believe that without, with certainty that the Russians killed these civilians as they were leaving Bucha. Now, some people would argue it wouldn't make sense for the Russians to do that. Obviously, they want to maintain so far the invasion has been one of the most civilized invasions when compared to any invasion the United States has, perpetrated. It's been quite civilized and gentle. They've focused on military targets. That's been, and for all intents and purposes, I can see, from what I see, it seems like that is the case. They have been avoiding civilian casualties, but civilian casualties have occurred nonetheless. And I'm sure there are instances when the Russians could have done better to avoid those civilian casualties. And I'm sure there are some intentional acts, I would think isolated, but we'll see as the true nature, the true story of the war comes out over the next weeks and months and even years. But so I saw the video, and of course the first reaction of, rubes is, oh my God, look what Russia did. Well, those civilians, there's a lot of possibilities. Let me just kind of enumerate all the possibilities here. One possibility is the Russians did indeed kill those civilians as they were leaving. It is very possible that it was a localized atrocity. The local commander of local forces upset. They were pissed off. Maybe they felt some of the civilians were collaborating with the enemy, and they murdered them. This is a possibility, and it is a distinct possibility, all other things being equal. Or it could have been that the civilians were killed in shelling by either side. Now, supposedly, before the Ukrainian forces entered Bucha, they shelled the city quite extensively. So that's going for the bodies I saw in the street on the video. Perhaps they were killed in a shelling. It is also possible that the Ukrainians themselves intentionally murdered the civilians in order to get another propaganda video out. Or it could even be that some of those, that they staged the whole thing, that the civilians were in fact, in the video in question, the one where the forces are driving down the street in Bucha, could have been that was a staged video, that live actors were there, or they were dummies or whatever. I'm not a expert on video forensic analysis, so we'll see. I'm sure there'll be people on both sides arguing one side or the other. Or it could have been that the Ukrainians literally killed some people and put them out in the street. Maybe they got some dead bodies that they found somewhere and laid them out there in a certain, way. I mean, some of the there was one on a bicycle. There was one body that looked like it was riding a bicycle as it it was there as if it had fallen while riding the bicycle. As if he had got shot riding a bicycle. So it just seemed too perfect to me. There's something about that got my hair standing up. That was part of the video of the people in the street as the Ukrainian forces were driving. So there's I haven't looked at the video too closely just because I don't want to, having seen some of these things myself in my life, and not really. I'm not really into seeing bodies. I'm not into seeing that. I've seen enough of that in my life. But I'm sure some forensic sleuths will be in all the usual places, and they'll be doing their analysis. And they've already been trying to argue that one of the bodies was sitting up as the car passed by, but it looks like the rear view mirror just distorted the image to me. But it could have also been an atrocity, a localized atrocity. I highly, highly doubt it would have been an atrocity that was sanctioned by the military command. The military command, I'm sure, has no interest in committing atrocities at all. They're already, they were losing the propaganda war from the start. Everything for the Russian army hinges on maintaining a professional invasion and not being, not committing any war crimes, because the friends that they do have in the world, which, arguably I would say most of the world is neutral, and they have quite a few powerful countries in their side of the court siding with them, but obviously war crimes being committed would fracture and strain those relationships, which is all another reason why the Ukrainians might set up a video like that, or God forbid, even outright kill civilians themselves. It wouldn't look. Some of these Ukrainian forces, I'm sure the vast majority of them are. I have to say this. I'm actually very impressed by the fight that the Ukrainians have put up. I'm actually very impressed. The Ukrainian people and the vast majority of the Ukrainian military are fantastic, courageous, stand-up people from what I see. It is just amazing. It really is inspiring seeing the fight they're putting up, the fight that they're fighting. It's amazing. It's very inspiring. So I don't want to cast dispersions or seem to be casting dispersions upon the Ukrainian people or the military itself. But there are rotten elements, and there always have for many years. There have been rotten elements within the government and within the military. Okay. And like I said, this was common knowledge before the war started and before the propaganda machine went on overdrive. This was common knowledge. You need only go on, preferably not Google, but another search engine, and start looking up stories of Ukraine starting go back to 2019, 2018, 2020, and you will see nothing but mostly nothing but articles painting a very negative picture of the Ukrainian regime. The Pandora Papers came out last year. I did a video on it calling bullshit. And Ukraine was determined by the Pandora Papers, according to, their investigation, to be one of the most corrupt countries in the world. But civilians have a short memory, and they're easily manipulated. And like I said, I have no skin in this fight. I see. I'm just trying to get a picture of what's actually going on, and I hope World War III doesn't start. That's the only thing I really care about in this whole affair is I hope World War III doesn't break out over this. Honestly. Because I live in a very densely urban area, and I don't want to be here when the nukes start falling out the sky, when the mushroom clouds start appearing on the horizon. I don't want to be. This is not a good place to be, folks. Hopefully we get some warning so I can get somewhere less densely populated. This place will be an absolute shit show if nukes start going off, provided I survive the blast in the first place. So that's the only thing I care about, really. But, I am a historian of sorts, an amateur historian. I love military history. So we're watching a real-life historical event happen before our eyes. It's very interesting. And I will harbor no delusion, no illusions. I don't know if that's the correct phrase. I will not mince words in that, I respect Vladimir Putin for his leadership. I'm not saying he's perfect. I don't necessarily trust him as far as, he has some connections to the World Economic Forum. He's made some weird comments about artificial intelligence and all this stuff. So there's some things there that I find a little alarming. So no, I don't want to move to Russia, and I don't care to meet Vladimir Putin, but you have to give him credit for being a strong leader that has done mostly right by his country, in my opinion. I mean, you look at what he's taken the country from the 1990s when he took over to now. It was he inherited an absolute wreck of a country. He kicked out all the scam artists, and that's where really the antagonism towards Vladimir Putin starts. And he's done right to build. He's done decent as far as getting the country back on its feet. And I think maybe he could have done more to try to encourage a diversification of the economy, I don't think it's really sustainable to have a resources-based economy for the foreseeable future. But who am I to, criticize that? So just need to get that out of the way, because just to be clear on that. But so back to Bucha, and let's get this here. Right up here. So first thing about Bucha was it's a fact that the Russians evacuated Bucha 4 days to 3 to 4 days before the Ukrainians arrived. And it's also a fact that in the intermediary time, Bucha was shelled. Okay. So it's a possibility that some of these civilians were killed in a shelling. The mass graves, maybe those civilians were killed by uh, unintentionally by the Russians, or even unintentionally by the Ukrainians over the course of the fighting, and the Russians disposed of the bodies. One thing I don't actually find that makes sense to me is that why would the Russians shoot these people and leave them in the middle of the street before they leave? So that doesn't make much sense to me. Another thing I got to bring up, and this is the main point I wanted to bring up, with all of these allegations, all of this information, whether you want to call it misinformation or not coming out, let's look at something here. So I got a couple. Okay, let's start with this. Kyiv Post, and I'm sure this is, who knows, it's in English, so it's probably Western backed, but Kyiv Post. August 6th, 2018. 4 years ago. 3 and some change. Some 85% of Ukrainians use smartphones. Okay. All of these allegations, of civilian casualties. Now, knowing what I know about how this works. 85% of Ukrainians have phones. First of all, we would see video on the internet, at least on Telegram, probably on Twitter, of Russians act. So if in the case of Bucha has a population of 36,000 people. And by the way, let's go back to this. First of all, there goes one source. 85% of Ukrainians use smartphones. So it doesn't say they own smartphones. It says they use smartphones. Now here goes Statista, and they're doing this damn thing again. They used to not do this. Let me see if I can. So here we go. Here's a view for free. They're not letting me do it. Do I have this? Okay, deny. So Statista had different sorts of statistics there. And they're saying that a lot of people in Ukraine have mobile phones. And it said something like 41% of residents owned a smartphone, 95% owned 92% reported owning a mobile phone. Most mobile phones have cameras. All smartphones have excellent cameras, or like the vast majority, even the cheap ones have cameras that'll do the job. So there's that. Bucha population is 36,971. How many are still there after the evacuation? I don't know. I'm sure there were several thousand residents still there. There had to be. Regardless, at least 50% of whoever was left has smartphones. Like, let's just extrapolate the data. It's closer to Kiev. It's a suburb of Kiev, so we can actually say perhaps more people in Bucha had or have a smartphone. And the vast majority, maybe everyone minus a few people, have a mobile phone. Most mobile phones have cameras. So, where is the footage of the Russians actually committing these atrocities? Where is it? Don't even tell me that it's too gory or too disturbing to put on Telegram, because nothing apparently is too disturbing to put on Telegram. I've seen none of those. I've seen no videos of anyone actually committing or any, I see no videos, no smoking gun evidence that the Russians did this. And this goes for all of the alleged war crimes, or most of them. I'm sure some of them are true, but if we had all of these civilian casualties that the Ukrainians claim, at the very minimum, I tell people this all the time, we would see footage, at the very minimum, of hospitals around Ukraine absolutely crowded to the brim with wounded people. And those videos, because listen, they're not allowed to show dead bodies on, mainstream sites. But they have no issue showing people in hospitals that are wounded. And they would have just nothing but footage of hospitals full of people. Because, like, let's say a shell goes off in the middle of a residential area during the daytime. There's people out. Okay, so here's how the casualties would work. You would have 10 people killed. Let's just use round numbers. You would have 50 to 100 people injured. Okay, so now if the Ukrainians are claiming thousands of civilians are killed, multiply that by, let's say, 10 to 50x, and that's how many injured you would have. That's just how this works. If we look at any, reliable casualty figures, first of all, a casualty, a lot of people don't realize, is either killed, wounded, or I believe is missing in action considered a casualty? I don't know. But so that's what a casualty actually is. But killed, so whenever you look at casualties, you'll see the numbers, and this is pretty much a uniform sort of phenomenon. Is in any military operation, you'll see, let's say 10,000 people killed. Let's look at Iraq. Well, 300,000. So I guess some of the more official, reliable numbers say 300,000 Iraqis were killed, and maybe close to 1 million wounded. So those were 1 million casualties. 300,000, over 1 million and some change casualties. Civilian casualties include the wounded. There's always vastly more wounded in any war zone than killed, but they're all usually called casualties. So if that's the case, if these figures that, if these allegations that the Ukrainians put out were true, we would see video. Not just some maternity hospital and they show a couple mattresses with blood on it and a couple people talking about how horrible it is. We would see operating hospitals in Ukraine full of wounded, and they would blast it all over TV. Just like they did with COVID. They would show Italy every day in the beginning of COVID. Full, all these people, just blah, blah, blah. Look at this. Oh my God, it's terrible. So we should support locking down. Don't get me started on that. So that's just common sense. So that's my thoughts on that. There's such coverage in even the poorest countries, India. I don't know how it is in Africa these days, but India, from what I understand, most people have phones, cell phones, and a lot of people have smartphones. And even though Ukraine is the poorest country in Europe, or now the poorest after this war started, it was always one of the poorest in Europe. But even given that it is the poorest country in Europe or close to it, cell phone coverage is ubiquitous, and smartphone coverage, you have the Kiev Post, which this could be, who knows where they're getting this figure. They're saying 85% of Ukrainians use smartphones. I don't know what the distinction between using and owning is, but we would see more videos of actual, I want to see if I'm going to believe civilian casualties being very high, which I don't think they are. I would need to see footage of hospitals, a hospital in Kyiv, for example. There's lots of, there are so many, most of the journalists are in Kiev, I want to say Kiev so bad. In Kyiv. So many journalists are in Kyiv. Why aren't they? Where's the footage? The CNN footage, the really nice, expensive camera footage, really well produced footage of the hospital in Kyiv, full to the brim with civilian wounded. Because I've seen it myself. I've seen hospitals like that myself. People on the ground, people in the hallways, dying. That's what you would see if you had high civilian casualties like what we had in Iraq. So anyway, that's it. That's just the common sense point I want to make. And I don't expect people who are predisposed to hating Russia because they got taken for a ride on Russiagate and they're still salty about that. People are, I think a lot of this bandwagon that people are on has to do with the fact that they had to concede that they got taken for a ride on Russiagate, but they just still, they hate Putin even more now for that. And they don't want to self-reflect and cope with the fact that they got duped. So now they can go ahead and forget about Russiagate and instead hate Putin for another reason. Hate him for the war in Ukraine. You know, so I don't expect people to actually get it that are just they're just going to hate Putin and they're just going to hate Russia no matter what, because they've been literally programmed to. And I refuse to be programmed. I refuse to be programmed, and I refuse to be silenced. And I hate all war. Okay, if you look at my Facebook page here, the vast majority of the articles I post are anti-war. I would have rather the Russians, I definitely do not condone the Russians invading Ukraine. However, we have to remember how the full context of what happened, and really the United States State Department and CIA did everything they could to push Russia to invade. So we have to give some of the responsibility to them and to the war machine and to the military industrial complex, NATO, which is a weapons lobby. Okay, they deserve some of the blame. I still think most of the blame should go to Russia and Putin for invading. And they're going to have to deal with the fallout, and the world's going to have to deal with the fallout. But the fact of the matter is, to me, it looks like they're achieving their objectives. The objectives they set out to achieve. And this is going to end badly for Ukraine and badly for the West, because the West is so full of itself and so completely psychotic at this point that there's no way the West can come out of this ahead. Okay, but that's my spiel on Bucha and what I think. So to conclude, I don't know if this atrocity was committed by the Russians. I don't know if it was committed by the Ukrainians. I don't know if it was a fake video. We've seen lots of fake videos, lots of lies from the Ukrainian government, and some lies from the Russian government as well. I'd have to say it seems like the Russians have been a little bit, the Ukrainians have been a bit more disingenuous, but they're in a situation where they're defending their country. They're doing what they have to do, what they think they have to do to get a leg up and to get an advantage. So I don't necessarily really, honestly, I don't necessarily condemn them for being disingenuous. You do what you got to do when you're being attacked. You know, like I said, these people have impressed me a lot. These are tough people, man. These people are fighters. And look, I wish we had more people like the Ukrainians in the United States. We got a bunch of weak, pathetic people in the United States. So I would trade Ukrainian citizens for United States citizens any day of the week. Trust me on that. We got some Ukrainians down here in South Florida. So, I'm happy to have them. We need people like them. They're going to be an asset if shit starts hitting the fan here. So, that's my spiel. Have a wonderful Sunday. I am out.